Okay, well, I just want to give a short thanks to Kathy, first of all, for a great couple first days, her committee for putting everything together. We're thrilled to have Calder Loth back. Calder was here in 2006, I think in 2002 or 3, and I remember that because I was filming him on a camera that I had from home. And it was right at the time we were having our first child. And so you have this juxtaposition of 18th century brickwork with, and all of a sudden there's a newborn coming out. True story. Rebecca's like, what in the hell is this? This is not our family? So everything I love right there, right? But Calder is a retired senior architectural historian with the Department of Historic Resources. He's been, anyone in Virginia history has worked with him, and he's just a wealth of knowledge, and we're really excited to have him back here. He's going to give us some of the origins of the architectural terms we use all the time. But I encourage you, really strongly encourage you to stick around after his talk because he's going to take us through the building. And it's nothing like having someone who knows these buildings take you through and give you a fresh set of eyes on it. So please stick around if you can. But let's welcome Calder Loth.
Thanks, Robert. And it's great to be back here again. I haven't the remotest idea what I talked on the last time. It was interesting. And I must say that the first time I ever came to Christ Church was as a UVA student. We decided we wanted to see the landmarks of the Northern Neck, and we came and saw the area and Savin Hall, and of course had to see Christ Church, and that was about 1965. Wall wasn't up then. But otherwise, things haven't changed much, and that's the magic of this church, that it is one of the, I would say, it is the finest colonial church in Virginia, and it is one in the most perfect condition. So what we're going to do is be talking about some of the architectural forms and details that you see in this church, and where those forms and details come from historically. So that will help us learn why the church looks the way it does. All right, so here we see Christ Church. Good thing I got this slide when I did, but it'd be hard to take it now with all the excavation. But also I want to say that this is a class, and so I'm going to expect some audience response. I know it's ridiculous, but it's the only way you learn these things. So, why does this church look the way it does? It is unlike many other churches in many respects. Why does it look particularly like this? This is the way we think most Episcopal churches should be looking, right? Quaint, oldie world, Gothic. Well, Christ Church doesn't look like that. And to understand some of that, where that look comes from. Now, this doesn't look like Christ Church, I know, but we have to go back to the early 18th century in England and decide and learn about what kind of churches were being built then. Not many of them, because they had plenty of churches dating back to the Middle Ages, but we're looking at St. Martin in the Fields here, which is one of the first large, important parish churches right in the heart of London, right on Trafalgar Square, being built to accommodate specific Anglican-style worship. Here's the church as it is today. It's designed by James Gibbs, one of the leaders of the Anglo-Palladian movement in the 18th century. And look at this building. You would say that is a church when you look at it, because it has a steeple. Here's the church, here's the steeple, so forth. Well, it is an urban church, and urban churches had steeples, so you could find them and identify them by the steeples in the winding streets of medieval London, or medieval streets in 18th century London. Look at it again. There are no religious symbols on this church whatsoever. Why? Because particularly in the 18th century, the Anglican Church was very anti-Catholic. They didn't want any Catholic iconography. They considered it improper. So instead of a cross up here, you have a weather vane. It's a civic amenity. People wanted to see which way the wind's blowing. Nearly all of the churches, urban churches, had a clock. Nobody had watches, so a clock is another civic amenity. And of course, you had a belfry, so you could call people to prayer. But the church body itself is like a Roman temple, temple-form church with a Corinthian portico on it. Okay. Let's look at the plan of the Gibbs Church, of St. Martin in the Fields. It's called an auditory church. What does that mean? Auditory means so you can hear. Because in the 18th century particularly, and you may know, and I'm probably telling you a lot of things you already know, but at least you're hearing it from a different point of view. It's all one big room. And unlike medieval churches, there is no deep chancel. There's no real choir area. The choir here sat in the gallery up in the back with the organ, and they weren't vested then. That was considered Catholic to high church. So it was arranged this way with the focus on the pulpit because it was important to hear the sermon and to see the preacher, to see him well. So it's right out here in the seats of the church, an auditory church. Sermons were the high point. Eucharist was rarely done, and I don't know about the practice here, but in most colonial churches, they were lucky to have it maybe several times a year, even 2 or 3 times a year, if possible. But it was not the high point of the service. The sermon was. Sermons could last up to an hour. So let's look at this inside cross view of the church. There's the pulpit right down where everybody could see the preacher and hear him talk. All the seating is focusing on that pulpit. And you see there's no deep chancel, there's no choir area, that's all up in the gallery. Auditory church. What am I getting at? Well, that gives you an idea of what life was like at a Sunday service in the 18th century. There was no mistaking the preacher. And does this look similar? Yeah. It's pretty standard treatment for 18th century Anglican church design. Everybody can see and hear, and there is the clerk down in front. If they had music, and particularly in the colonial period, because organs were very rare and good choirs were very rare, but if any kind of music normally was just chanting the psalms, and the clerk would be beating up the meter on his desk to make sure everybody was speaking together. So here we have same sort of thing. Now, Christ Church is cross-shaped. It's not big rectangular like St. Martin in the Fields. And I can't prove it, but just from my own observation, I think it was done this way, again, to emphasize the pulpit, to make sure everybody could see and hear it clearly. So you have side aisles. If you stretched all of these out, the aisles would go much farther back, and that would take people farther away from the pulpit. So doing it this way puts the pulpit right center of what's going on in the church, just so you can see and hear the preacher. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, this is the clerk's desk. This is the lectern. Is that normally where the Bible is read from, or is it read from
second
here?
one.
It's read from here.
Yeah.
That's the readers.
Okay, and what is it?
Clark.
That's for
That's
the-
right,
that's
okay,
for
it's
the-
just the reverse of what I saw. I think it's just the reverse in a quiet church, because, no, they've got the Bible there too, so, but same sort of thing. This is the dominant element of the interior of a quiet church as well. Similar cross-shaped plan, so everybody could see and focus well on the pulpit. And, well, you didn't have altars in an Anglican church. Altar was considered Catholic. You had, for celebrating the Eucharist, or communion, you had a holy table, a communion table, and it was usually portable. You have an original one here, which is an amazing survival. And, of course, They copied yours for theirs. That's a modern holy table. All right, we'll talk about the altarpiece a little later, but again, pulpit dominating the interior. Now, I would like to say I could find some parallels in country churches in England. Were they building this similar kind of church there in the 18th century? Well, I even have a book here on English country churches. Well, 99% of the churches illustrated in this book are medieval ones. They had more medieval churches than they knew what to do with. So very, very few 18th century churches survived in the countryside of England. This is one of them here, and you can see it's a pretty plain Jane building. Just a, temple form with a pediment, no portico, just an entrance porch here. And it does have a belfry because nearly all of the English parish churches in the countryside were located near a village, so it was important to hear the bell. There's no steeple or bell on, or belfry on Christ Church. Why is that? There's no one around to hear it. They just had to go by the sun to get to church on time. But this is not, this is typical for the few country churches that exhibit or existed in Britain in the 18th century. Not many of them. They had a surplus of country churches. So you don't get a country church in Virginia looking something like this. This is St. Lawrence in Goodworth in Norfolk, one of my favorite churches. I took this photograph of 20 years ago. Can't get any cuter than this, but and this looks very staid compared to it, because this is the age of rationalism. You didn't want all this romantic look. So there are few things you're not going to find on a Anglican church in colonial Virginia. You're not going to have the side entrance here. That was standard for country churches, medieval ones, except for one church, and we all know what that one is, right? Your Comico, sure. That's looking backwards rather than looking forwards. It's old-fashioned in that way. Now, this church did have a belfry at one time, a tall church tower with the bells up in it, but that fell off. So it's got a blank here at the west end where you normally would have a church tower. Otherwise, that's not that unusual for typical country churches in England, going up even into the present. Now, of course, in the Puritan Revolt, they've lost most of the stained glass windows in England. It was horrible iconoclasm. Going against Catholic idolatry, smash every stained glass window you could find, melt down every communion service, plate silver service you could find, smash every statue you could find, take down every crucifix you could find. This church did preserve its early altar screen, which is a rare survival. Why they didn't destroy that, I don't know, but they did outfit it, retrofit it with 18th century pews, not unlike what you have here in Christ Church. But no, a very shallow chancel. I guess there are a couple of seats up here for singers, but that's about it. It's a tiny church. More akin to the quality that you have in Christ Church is a couple of the Wren churches in central London, which are brick, like St. Benet's, beautiful brickwork, not that different from what you have here. Now, of course, what Wren was doing was rebuilding all of the parish churches in central London that were destroyed in the Great Fire of London. So all of these are built on the foundations of medieval churches. But that was the first big wave of new churches meant to accommodate the Protestant form of worship. And I don't know how many of you have been in Wren churches in London, but you can see they don't have chancels, they don't have deep transepts, they don't have, and the pulpits are very much a dominant feature of the interior. Roof form on Christ Church. It has a hip roof. Hip roofs were not common in England at all up until the late 17th, early 18th century, when you had the Anglo-Palladian movement. The architects of beginning with Inigo Jones, got carried away with the architecture of Andrea Palladio. Inigo Jones went to Italy, saw a lot of Palladian villas. He did a book of his designs showing the Palladian Italian Renaissance influence. And a dominant feature of a lot of the simpler villas that Palladio designed was the use of a hip roof. So we have hip roofs on the gables of Christ Church. And it's interesting that in the 18th century, hip roofs were often referred to in England as Italian-style roofs. There weren't many of them like this otherwise. So that is an origin of this type of roof. And if you look kind of cross-eyed at the picture of Christ Church, you can see that the projecting entrance wing out here kind of resembles the relationship, say, of a portico to the rest of the building. It is again a kind of classical reference. All right, now we're going to get into architectural literacy. I teach architectural literacy because most people don't know anything about architectural literacy. Looking at their smartphones all the time. Now, here is one of the entrances to Christ Church, and this form with a pediment supported by pilasters or even columns is called an aedicule. Anybody ever heard of an aedicule? Why do we call it an aedicule? All right. Well, in ancient Roman houses, most of them, you had somewhere on the interior a little shrine built into the wall with an image of the household god, the guardian spirit of the house. It's called the Lares. Here's that guardian spirit here. This is in Pompeii. And those little shrines were usually topped by a pediment and held up by tiny columns or maybe pilasters. This is a very simple one. And that was called an aedicule. Ides in Latin is the word for building. Aedicule is the diminutive. Little building. Does this look like a little building, right? So now you can impress your visitors when you take them in the church. Going through an aedicule. Everybody say that. Aedicule. All right, now you know where that term comes from, but that is the proper term for your doorways here. Now, aedicules can get very grand, particularly in big urban temples like the Pantheon. Beautiful aedicules here with precious marbles, almost perfect condition. But this was a big city temple. And of course the Pantheon was a temple to all the gods, so instead of Christian images in here, you would have statues of Mars or Apollo or Roman gods. But the Pantheon has been a Christian church for nearly, almost 2,000 years now. But that form got to be associated with Catholic churches, especially. You see it in Anglican churches, you see it in other churches, but particularly associated with Catholic churches. They picked up the aedicule idea as an altarpiece. Here's a beautiful one dating from the early 19th century, the Madeleine Church in Paris. But instead of Mars or somebody, you have the Virgin Mary and Christ Child here, emphasizing the altar down here. And even in Richmond, in Sacred Heart Cathedral Catholic Church, you have an aedicule for one of the side chapels there. But that form can be traced all the way back to Roman precedent as a way of encasing or showing off a religious object. Here we have statue of the Virgin again. But the aedicule, again, as I mentioned with Christ Church, became popular for doorways. Some of the 18th century pattern books have innumerable designs of aedicule type doorways. Here's a beautiful Doric one from I think, Abraham Swan's book on, what do you call it, the British architecture. So an aedicule doorway was a way of letting somebody know that somebody important lives in this house, or it's a way of celebrating your visitors, that if you go through what was formerly a religious motif, it really adds great importance to domestic architecture and to religious architecture as well. One of the most beautiful aedicule doorways is on the Hammond Harwood House in Annapolis. Beautiful carving by William Buckland, and he's added all these wonderful festoons here. But like so many of these designs, they were adapted from illustrations in architectural pattern books, such as you see here from, this is also from Abraham Swan's book. Same kind of frieze with decorated with oak leaves, same kind of ionic column, same kind of pediment. Although Buckland went one step farther of making a compass top doorway with transom and these beautiful carved festoons here.
Excuse me,
Yes,
what is the material? Is that stone or wood?
This is wood.
Over the door, it's all carved wood?
It's all carved wood.
Thank you.
Buckland had a whole team of wood carvers. If you've ever been to Gunston Hall, you see their work with hand. All that beautiful woodwork inside. It's not necessarily carved by Buckland, it was carved by mainly William Sears.
Okay. Beautiful.
So, but your doorways here are not stone, they're not wood, they're brick. And wonderful examples of brickwork. So what's going on here? Why do we have brick? Well, first of all, I think wood would be a little impractical, doesn't hold up quite as well. Two, you don't have a lot of good building stone around here. So what stone details you have to come from some distance. But also, they're picking up from what was going on at exactly the same time in London. So we ask, why a brick aedicule doorway? Well, here's the Inns of Court, the law offices in central London, dating from about the same time as Christ Church. We have nearly, a very similar door, not quite as pretty and as elaborate as yours, but same idea. Because there wasn't a lot of good building stone close to London. If you're going to have good stone buildings like St. Paul's Cathedral, use Portland stone, that was very expensive and had to be brought from a considerable distance. So they had good brick masons in London and did good aedicule doorways in brick. And here you have nearly identical one, because I think a lot of these masons were English trained. Nearly identical one up the road at Lambs Creek Church in King George County. Very similar. Or you have the main doorway with the segmental arch pediment here, very similar to what's going on in the Middle Temple in London. You're just picking up on what was in style and what was practical in London. And I have no doubt that your brick masons here were London trained. Okay, why alternating pediments? How can they all be the same? You have a triangular pediment here, you have a segmental pediment there. Well, this goes back to ancient Rome too. Here's the Temple of Augustus in Pompeii. Now originally this would have had a lot of fancy, maybe stucco work or decorations or moldings, but they all got destroyed with the eruption of Vesuvius. But anyway, you can see that you have alternating triangular and segmental pediments. It's a very standard form of decoration on classical buildings, especially when you have a row of openings. Here's a little better preserved example of it in the so-called Temple of Diana, an ancient Roman temple in Nîmes, France, alternating triangular and segmental pediments. Why do you think they did it this way?
Demonstrate skill.
Well, you know.
Not boring.
Break up
Pleasing
some
to the eye.
Somebody said it, it's not boring. It moves the eye along. If they were all the same, they'd be monotonous. This moves the eye along. It creates a rhythm and a cadence to the openings. And where might you find the most conspicuous example of alternating triangular and segmental patterns? Absolutely. Spot on. The White House is nothing more than an Anglo-Palladian English country house. But it's a wonderful building. It's a beautiful work of architecture, but here you see alternating triangular and segmental patterns. Look for them. They're not as rare as you might think. Now, looking at the doorway, particularly what's going on in the opening here, is these guys relied on English pattern books. That's the way you communicate architectural information. You do it through publication. England was turning out these pattern books by the dozens, and most of them, the less expensive ones, made their way right here to America and were very much in use. I think it's unquestionable that the doorway, particularly the transom, the paneling design, came right out of When You Pay Pennies, Magnum and Parbo book of 1728, about the same time that people were thinking about building Christ Church. Fortunately, some of these pattern books have been reprinted. I brought a copy of Penny's book. It was not an expensive book. A book by William Gibbs would be very expensive, but in here you find these designs which they were picking up on. Now, what's interesting is they mixed and matched. This isn't exactly like this doorway. You've got this business here, which is very similar. And look at the entablature up here. And we'll talk more about this, but it's echoed here. It's just that we're using the Tuscan or Doric capital here instead of the Ionic. All right. As I say, they mixed and matched. Another book, very much in use in colonial America, is William Salmon's Palladio Londinensis. Now, he's picking up on the Palladian theme here. Palladio Londinensis means Palladio adapted for London design. This wasn't a terribly expensive book either. Fortunately, it is available in reprint. Okay, look carefully at the paneling here. Now, again, similar type of pediment here, segmental pediment. Here we have modillions rather than dentils. But look at the doorway here. So maybe you already have seen this, but this portion of it is copied exactly from that pattern there, just this bit here. So mixing and matching. You start grumbling around in pattern books, you just won't get any sleep. There's a lot to do. One other example of this, similar example, is at Tuckahoe. This is the original doorway there. And dating from this portion here, dating from the 1740s or so. Again, you have these beautiful gauge brick arches over the windows here. And the masons, of course, were trained to do this, but they were also working with pattern books. This is a similar sort of thing on brickwork in another pattern book by William Halfpenny, dating from 1725. Brought a cheap reprint of it here, but it has all sorts of designs for bricks and construction techniques. Here is, I think, this similar plate, but I copied this illustration out of this book. So it was guiding them on how to do this very beautiful work. Everybody knows the term gauge brick. You do make a good, you're well trained. All right.
Explain.
Well, you can have rub bricks on the corners of buildings. You select the bricks for corners of buildings. We can look at it outside because they were particularly hard and they were more even color, and you rub them with another brick or a stone to make them smooth face. That's a rub brick. A gauge brick is a rub brick. See, it's all uniform color, beautiful brick, bright red. But it's gauge, meaning they're cut to special shapes. See, all of these are individual shapes as part of the part of the arch here. And if you took all of these border joint lines here and drew them straight down, they would hit right there. So very carefully calculated gauge break. So, and I think it's unquestionable that probably the same masons that worked on Rosewell worked on Christ Church. Can you see the slightly different colored bricks on the poor Rosewell? It's so weathered, but these are rub bricks around the jambs of the windows, and gauge bricks for the string course here. Identical brickwork. What we call this is Flemish bond with scattered glazed headers, not an overall checkerboard pattern, but scattered, so just here and there and here and there. As you have in Christ Church, it just gives a little extra sparkle to the brick walls. And identical treatment with the masonry details. You have the impost, stone impost molded blocks here, similar keystone, stone lintel, sill, exactly like you have at Christ Church. Undoubtedly the same masons worked on this about the same time. Here's a close-up of one of the keystones in bad shape. It's since fallen out, but identical to what you have in Christ Church. And it is, Thomas Waterman said, these stone details are Portland stone from England. No, they're not. It's local stone from the Fredericksburg area. There is a vein of sandstone up there, often called a quiet stone. And a quiet church uses a lot of that quiet stone decoration. So it's a local sandstone brought from, probably by boat or barge or something, from the Fredericksburg area, or the Potomac. The quiet quarry is on the Potomac River. And that's the same stone that built the White House, the original portion of the U.S. Capitol. Yes?
Was that building a church or a residence? The Rosewell?
That was the house.
It was a house.
It's probably the biggest, finest house in Columbia.
I would say.
I trust most of you have been to the ruin. It's on display now.
Yeah.
A lot of these lintels fell out. I think there was an explosion at the Naval Weapons Depot across the river. It shook the building. One of these fell down on the ground in perfect condition. And my colleague Ed Chappell, the late Ed Chappell, picked it up and brought it to the office just to keep it from being stolen so we could look after it. I used it for many years in my office as a stamp for ashtrays. But anyway, when the Rosewell Foundation was formed, we decided that we really ought to turn it over. So it's there on display, but it's in excellent condition. Now, again, you find this sort of thing, if you're looking for it in England. Here is this identical keystone out of a London early Georgian house. Here's a similar one in the village of Tewkesbury. So be on the lookout for this sort of thing. All right, now comes the tedious part. Basic literacy in the classical language. Now we all know the 5 orders of architecture, don't we? Doric, Mayan, and so on. Tuscan. I'm going to talk about the Tuscan order because it's the simplest and it'll get across, I think, more conveniently some of the details that you see here in the church. Now, the Tuscan order, the name derives from the Etruscans, and the Etruscans were originally settled in what is today Tuscany. And I say the order is a Renaissance invention because the Tuscans built in wooden architecture. And by the imperial period, time of Caesar Augustus, we had one architect who wrote a treatise on architecture, the only treatise on architecture we have surviving from ancient times. And he talked about the Tuscan form, but he said it's wooden architecture, so none of it survives. But he described it enough that the Renaissance architects developed what they called a Tuscan order based on Vitruvius's descriptions and made it part of the official canon of the orders of architecture. All right. Now, to have architecture, you have to have something holding something up. What's holding up is column. What's being held up is all this business collectively called the entablature. You've heard of both of these. Now, the entablature, the word entablature comes from the Italian word tavola, which means table. And tavola is a Latin word, originally meaning a board. A dining room table is essentially a board off of which you eat. Now, the column, the word column comes from the Latin word columna, which originally meant the projecting object, something straight up. So, column holding up entablature. Now, we don't have columns on our articles here. We have pilasters. Comes from a Latin word pila. And from that we get pillar. It's a non-structural column. It's flat, so it's just decorative. So that is ultimately a pier or a pilaster. Pilaster. Y'all use that term, don't you?
Yes.
Now, up the top of the entablature, all of this business is collectively called the cornice. Cornice comes from a Greek word, korona, meaning curved or bent, where you get crown, because that's curved, right? Then below that you have a broad band called the frieze, which could be the decorated or plain. And then below that you have a two-plane member here, can be three or it could be just plain, one member, called the architrave. All right, let's look at the frieze. The term frieze comes from the term Phrygia. Phrygia was an area in Asia Minor which was known for making very beautiful decorated bands of cloth, or frieze. And the Latin word is Phrygian, and from that we get the word fringe as well as frieze, but it ultimately comes from Phrygia. Have you ever heard of the Phrygians? Yeah. Bible times? Okay. Well, that's where that term comes from. The architrave is a combination of a Greek word and a Latin word. Archos, Greek, meaning chief. Traves, meaning, it comes from a Latin word, meaning a beam, structural member. Archos, like archangel, chief angel. Trave, that's where we get trabeated, like trabeated arch is a flat arch with big beam. Architrave. All right? Got that. Now, we've got to break down the cornice. It's broken down to a bunch of things. Up at top, you have what's called the crown molding, which comes, again, from the Latin word corona, meaning something curved. Or a fancier term for it is the summation. The first part of this word is a simon. I'll talk about that, which comes from the Greek word kuma. Kuma means something curvy or billowy, like cumulus cloud. That's where that term comes from. Okay. Then below that, you have a band called the fascia. And that's the Latin word for a band or a bandage. And from fascia, we get fasces or fascias or fascist, because the fasces, this thing, a bunch of rods and an axe bound by fascias, these bands here, was the symbol of the fascist movement. And in ancient Roman times, when the emperor walked around town, he would have walking with him two guys called lictors, and each of them would be carrying fasces like that with axes, symbols of his authority. Get out of the way, because if you get in a mess, he could take those bands off and got sticks to beat people and axes to go after them. It's a way of controlling riots. Underneath that is a soffit. Underneath of anything is a soffit. Underneath of this window level is a soffit. Underneath of a door frame is a soffit. It comes from the Latin word suffigo, which means something attached to something. That's where we get the term suffix. Like that's an end of a word. That's something attached to a word. That's a suffix. All right. I really don't know Latin that well. I passed Latin in high school on the promise I'd never take it again. How many of you took Latin in school? Oh, Lord. Well, you know where I'm coming from. All right, is any of this familiar to you? No. Good. Congratulations. All right, and underneath the suffix, we have a series of moldings. This is the plainest in the Tuscan order, called the bed moldings. Think of them as being embedded under the socket. And we got two moldings here. First, there is this quarter-round molding called an ovolo, which comes from the Latin word ovum, which means egg, because this is kind of egg-shaped, right? And underneath that, you have cavetto, a concave molding. Comes from the Latin word cavus, which means something hollowed out. And what is hollowed out that sounds like a cave? Something, so this is hollowed out. And what is all of that for? Well, we think it all derives from wooden construction. So here's a demonstration building in Colonial Williamsburg. Here it's a way of encasing the structural members in wooden construction. So what do we have here, class? Up at top we have a ground molding, then the no, that's the frieze. What is this? Fascia. Underneath that is the and down here are some bed moldings. Congratulations. Now, separating the frieze from the architrave is a little thin band called a tenium. And it's both a Latin and Greek word. Both the Latins and the Romans and the Greeks use the same term for this narrow. It means a ribbon or a band, something very narrow. And it also is the ancient word for a sweatband. And it is also the medical term for a tapeworm, because that's what it looks like. Now, what ancient people used yards and yards of pin? The Egyptians, that's what they wrapped their mummies in. Ribbons, not tapeworms, but... Okay. Now we get to a very conspicuous part of this church, the exterior entablature. This rounded frieze here, right? It's called a pulvinated frieze. Comes from the Latin word pulvinus, means a swelling, or a swelling shape, or a cushion shape, or a bolster. Because that's what it looks like. That's the way we name things, because they remind us of something else, like a computer mouse. So here we have a pulvinated frieze. You use that term?
Yes.
Good. You're ahead of me. Well, here are bolsters. That's what it looks like. I couldn't find a pattern book illustration dating from just before the construction of Christ Church. This is from Batty Langley's The Builder's Jewel of 1741. So this would probably not have been in use, unless it took a long time to get this entablature up, but this is slightly later than what we think is the finishing date of Christ Church. But it's the one illustration I could find that shows a dental bed molding here with a pulvinated frieze. It says B. Langley invented 17. He didn't invent it. I mean, the Romans used it. So, now I bet you can't guess why we call those dentals. And actually, they're symbolic representations of wooden members, ends of wooden members in wooden construction. But we have pulvinated friezes from Roman times here, right in downtown Rome. The temple, the Divine Hadrian, has this pulvinated frieze with dentils up there. Also, this is an illustration of the same sort of thing, but with an egg and dart molding from the Baths of Diocletian. Now, if you go to the Baths of Diocletian, this jumble of ruins in downtown Rome, you're not going to find this intact. This is composed of fragments of Renaissance architects studying fragments put together this order, which was originally intact in the Baths of Diocletian. Palladio used a pulvinated frieze on the Villa Rotunda, but with modillions instead of dentils. But here we have the pulvinated frieze and a three-part architrave. And guess where? Fulminated frieze, dentals, 3-part, I don't know whether this counts as one of the fascias in an architrave, but anyway, at least there are 2 there, and maybe just a little extra. So, okay, review. We have, going across the top here, the top, but what is the top molding of the pediment?
Cornice.
Crown mold.
Crown molding, the very top thing, the crown, underneath dentals. Then we have the illuminated frieze, architrave. All right, similar. Very good. Now we go to the capital. Capital comes from the Latin word caput, which means head. What happens when you decapitate? All right, so we break down the capital. The very top portion of the capital, excluding this little molding here, is called an abacus. You've heard that term? Yeah. An abacus is something you use to figure on, and that's why we call this an abacus, because it resembles that board. All right, abacus. And it comes from a Hebrew word, ultimately meaning dust. Underneath that is a circular round molding with a quarter round profile called the echinus. You know that term? All right. So maybe it's because it's the Latin word for a sea urchin or a hedgehog, because it's what it resembles. This curve here on a sea urchin or on the back of a hedgehog resemble this molding in the capital, echinus. Echinos in Greek, echinus in Latin. Echinus. Tell your guests that you're real smart. All right. And below this is the neck. Also, it's also in Greek called the trachelium, because what's in the neck? Your trachea, so that's where the term trachelium comes from. So underneath the trachelium, you have the hypotrachelium. But this molding here, half round, is called an astragal, coming from the Latin astragalus, which is the word for the ball of the ankle joint, this thing that sticks out, this half round curve from your ankle. Think of it as your ankle bone, the astragal. All right. So we review. Now we know all of these right now. We don't need to go through them again. But we do have on the capital here, we have the abacus. Underneath this quarter round molding. It's not round here because it's a pilaster capital, but it is what? The echinus, the hedgehog. And then the astragal, the ankle bone. Okay. All right, well, yeah, I've already, well, you have it here. Well, okay, now this is, you have something that's not quite right here. This isn't a half-round molding. It is a different molding here. It's S-curved. That is an interesting detail, because the S-curved echinus can be traced back to an ancient source, the Baths of Diocletian, the Doric order of the Baths of Diocletian. This didn't survive intact. You have just fragments that survived, and they were drawn up, and from the Renaissance and later architects did a full illustration of what the Doric of the Baths of Diocletian looked like. Jefferson used this order on Pavilion 1 at the University of Virginia, but it has an S-shaped echinus called a cyma recta echinus. Cyma means curvy. Remember I talked about cymation earlier. Recta means straight. You know more than I do. All right. Because I looked it up in the dictionary last night. So here we have a cyma recta curve. cyma meaning curve, recta meaning straight. In other words, it starts out horizontally and ends up horizontally. Now, cyma reversive molding starts out vertically and ends up vertically. So, just the difference between the two, cyma recta and cyma reversive. Here you have a what? What kind of curve? Well, it's written up there, cyma recta. And here's an illustration out of William A. Penny's book, right here, of the cyma recta echinus. So that may be where these guys here in Christchurch got that from. But that's just a variation, a fairly rare variation, so look for it. And here we have the ankle bone. Aspirin, good. All right, now on on all of this, you have an awful lot of little thin lines. See all this, and this, and this, and this, and this. I didn't talk about this. They're called fillets. Comes from a French word ultimately meaning thread, something really thin, which comes from the Latin word filum, something very thin. You know, what's the skim on top of water called? Film, isn't it? What's a thin piece of meat called? Fillet, right, okay. Filums, or fillets. There are lots of fillets here in Christchurch. So here we have fillets, adding to this very interesting corner of the church there. All right, getting down to the base of the church, base of the column, you have this half-round molding here, bigger than the astragal, called the torus. Comes from a Latin word meaning swelling, or it's a word for muscle, like your bicep. It swells and makes this big curve. And below that is the plinth. Comes from a Latin word plinthos, or a Greek word, or plinthos, Greek plinthos, means brick, because it looks like a brick. Well, it doesn't look like one of your bricks here, because it's long and thin in it. This is a different kind of brick. Well, actually, it's based on a Roman brick. Roman bricks are long and thin. Here are Roman brick walls, a little thin. They're not like our normal English statue bricks. Here are these thin bricks in the ruins of the Baths of Constantine in Rome. And it got to be popular in the late 19th, early 20th century. Carnegie Hall is laid in these thin Roman bricks. There are houses in Richmond, some of them have Roman bricks. I like it. All right, now, down the base of the pilaster, you hear in Christchurch, and on the outside too, this type of base, which is two toruses, torus here, with a concave or cavetto, is really an elliptical cavetto here, called a scotia. Anyway, that particular form sitting on the plinth is called an attic base. Now that doesn't mean it's something up in the top of the house where you keep junk. It comes from Attica, which was the ancient term for the area around Athens. Well, what was going on there? Well, particularly in the Hellenistic period, the Emperor Hadrian, he really thought of himself Greek and made himself a Greek citizen, and was responsible for a number of important buildings in Athens, late. So one of them was the Arch of Theseus, also known as Hadrian's Arch, in downtown Athens. And I'm pointing out here, you can't see it very well, the attic base on these columns. And here is an illustration of that particular base. Same sort of thing, torus, scotia, torus, plinth. The attic base, which you have, well, not only on the inside, but you have as the base of your pilasters here. It could be really Doric. Tuscan that we just looked at is much simpler. It doesn't have two toruses. So this is really a Doric base here. Torus, scotia, torus, and then plinth. Although these plinths are interesting, they splay out just a little extra bit of artistry there. All right, looking back at this, the entablature has, of course, crown molding, fascia, soffit, bed moldings. But this part of here, it doesn't have any crown molding on it, does it? No, not supposed to. Romans didn't do that. Renaissance architects never put the crown molding at the base of a pediment. Why? Because it looks better without having it there. Also, now think of a pediment on the exterior of the building. Pediment was originally, well, the crown molding was originally a gutter. So you didn't need it running across the base of the pediment because there was no place much for the water to develop, so it really wasn't necessary. So here it is in more properly proportioned on Mount Vernon, the doorway there. You see no crown molding going across the base of the pediment. Watch that, because a lot of people trying to think they can deal with traditional architecture miss that little point. And it looks better without it. And here we have, all right, fascia, bed moldings, frieze, architrave. Yep. Yep. What's that? Abacus. Yeah.
Taurus?
Echinus.
Echinus, hedgehog, sea urchin, ankle bone, astragon. I'm going to leave all these images with you so you can look at them to your heart. Now, we all love a quiet church, but they didn't know how to do it right. What did they do? They carried the crown molding across the base of the pediment. You're not supposed to do that. And you look at a lot of cheap colonial revival houses, they'll miss that as well. Okay, now you have a beautiful altarpiece here. And you all know that by law you had to have the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue. These are not original here. I don't know whether you ever had mixed in here the Creed and the Lord's Prayer. Did you have that originally? Don't know how. Quiet Church is one of the few churches that does have them all original intact. But you see, there were 4 panels there. You only have 2, so we got to somehow come up with a conjectural design on how that was done. But anyway, we have a beautiful segmental top to this thing with the pulvinated frieze. It's really, really fine survival. And if this looks familiar to you, it has a really prestigious granddaddy in Chapel Royal at Hampton Court. Now, I don't know whether this ever had the Decalogue or any of that, and I don't think this paneling is original, but this room gets worked over. I mean, it's obviously from the Tudor period, and then the Anglicans put in this altarpiece. I think that's probably by Sir Christopher Wren, who did the wings, the later wings on Hampton Court. Now, I'm sorry I don't have a better photograph of this. The balustrade. This is a really wonderful balustrade. Very complex with fluted columns here, which I have not seen before on any colonial period. Balusters. All right. Now, this is a very, very elaborate version of what we call vase and column balusters. And a good example of a more straightforward version is in the stair at Independence Hall. Here's the vase, and here's the column. Of course, they decrease in size to accommodate the rise in the railing. Vase and column balusters. Here's the vase. All right. And that is actually the real baluster. And that shape comes from Roman candlesticks. Here's a engraving by Piranesi showing that vase shape. Now, the Romans didn't have balusters. It was a Renaissance invention. The Romans had what we call Roman lattice. You know, it looks like the Union Jack panels, all these crosses, that either in bronze or wood or iron or marble, actually. Okay. So I'll just have that on the Supreme Court in Washington. Look for it next time you have to stand trial there. Here's a standard balustrade, just the single balustrade. It's a Renaissance dating from the 17th century in Vicenza. Why do we call it balustrade? Well, it comes from the Latin word, or actually the Italian word, balastro, which is the Italian word for the shape of the pomegranate buds. See, there it is. So anybody growing pomegranates, it should be looking like this pretty soon, so go ahead and say, that's a baluster, and I know why you're called that. That's where that term comes from, that we use on railings that look like that. But this is taking it to its illogical conclusion, just adding moldings and moldings and moldings and moldings. So you, down somewhere in here, you might find a bit of that classic baluster shape. But we call this whole thing the balustrade, coming from. Now you can have double balusters, where you have the pomegranate on top and on bottom, creating vertical symmetry. This is actually my front porch. Double ballot. I mean, it's Victoria. They turned this stuff out by the mile in Fan District in Richmond. So if I'm sitting out there and the conversation starts lingering, and I can say, well, you know, that's a double baluster, and that term comes from the all right, Paul, give me another drink, please. We're all,
that it sits on, the block that it sits on, does that have a name?
Well, ultimately, it would be a plinth, I guess. Yeah. This, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there it is.
Yeah.
A little more normal shape. All right, we're coming to the end now. Talk about your wonderful treasure of original window sash here. And I found, just looking to one of my books, a identical pattern in this chapel in England, which, damn it, got torn down in the 1920s. It doesn't exist. There's a bad photograph of it, but somebody did a nice drawing. So there is definite English precedent for this pattern. Now I'm going to point out a very esoteric little detail about this. These are double hung windows, I mean sliding sashes. I think the upper one is fixed, isn't it? It doesn't move, but the bottom one does move. All right, look at it. It looks like all of these buttons, the sash bars, are all about the same size, even the meeting rail here. Now, all right, bear with me, it's a little bit complicated. The rails and stiles of a sash window normally would be all the same thickness. The stiles here, the vertical pieces, and are twice as thick as what you see here, because the other half is in the groove here to hold the sash in place. Now, if they made that rail and stile the same width as the meeting rail here, it would be too thick, so they thin it down. Actually, this member here going into the wall is double the thickness of this. But they thin this out so that it all looks like, yeah, better. And that's something that many restoration architects and many builders of colonial style houses miss. See, all looks just fine, right? They didn't know that there. Now that is a very important historic landmark done by a very important restoration architect. I'm not going to name it. So when you go there and see this house, you say, that doesn't look right. And it doesn't look right. Anyway, the sliding sash windows were really an English invention, and one of the greatest displays of early sliding sash windows, double hung windows, is on Hampton Court. All original by Sir Christopher Wren, and you see, he knows what he's doing here. That is about the same thickness as the buttons and the rest of the sashes. I'm not going to say where this is, but
Is it in Richmond?
Richmond. No, it's Westmoreland.
This was when the house was restored back in the 1930s, and it really missed on that one. It just doesn't look right. So be on the lookout, and you can say, aha, if you want to see how it's done, you know where to come. All right, we're almost at the end here. A wonderful interior with this wonderful pulpit with the decorated pulvinated frieze. And I show this illustration here because this is something I want to talk about when we go inside. But notice how they're praying here from this 18th century engraving. So, all right, final exam. This is a, that is a, where is the crown molding here? Not there. Then we have the, what's this in? What's my nose attached to? Right. Then we have the bed molding with devils. Then we have this culminated frieze. Then we have architrave. Then we have, what are the little lines here, extra things? Fillets. All right, there is the top of the Capitol. Abacus, the hedgehog. Margaret, ankle bone. You all deserve good grades. So that's sort of why the church looks the way it does, and I hope it gives you something to talk about. If you have time to go through all of this, I'm probably bore the heck out of your guests, but anyway, it's interesting. And once you're attuned to this, you see it absolutely everywhere because it is the common language of much of the architecture of Western civilization.